Professor, when people hear Paul and Elder model, and it can sound intimidating. And in simple terms, what is this model and why is considered the gold standard for structured thinking?
Okay, great. So think of making a decision. How do you know if you've made a good decision? Well, if you haven't decided in advance what kind of output you're hoping for and what are the standards, so what are the criteria for your output, right? So the first part of the Paul and Elder model is the standards. So anytime you evaluate something, you're using a set of standards and you apply them to some criteria. So if you want to analyze some reasoning, so if you have somebody is arguing for lower taxes or higher taxes, then you can break down the argument into its parts. For example, what is the purpose of the argument? What are the assumptions that the argument is based on? What are the main conclusions? And you can attempt to evaluate of those elements of reasoning. So was the purpose of the argument clear? Are the conclusions significant? Are the implications fair? And you can just go through and you're applying standards to elements. So typically students ask me a question. If I want to answer in a reasonable way, I often have to ask them, what is the purpose of their question? So if the purpose is not clear, I would ask, okay, well, why are you asking me when the homework is due? That's because you don't want to do the homework or you're worried about grading the homework. But in my class, I'm not concerned about strict deadlines for homework. I'm concerned about the quality of thinking. So I would ask, what's the purpose of your question? I'm not a big fan of saying step by step because in any situation, we don't want to start from the beginning and then just go mechanically through all of the elements. If you practice the Paul and Elder method, you would jump to the elements that you identify as being unclear or you need to know better about the assumptions. So you're not just going and starting from any order. There are the elements that exist in all reasoning. So if you're truly reasoning about something, it will include all of those elements to some extent. And if we're communicating about it, then we have to identify unclear parts, try to improve them.
Paul and Elder model is built on three main pillars. So elements, standards, and traits. Mm-hmm. So before we jump into each one, how do these three parts actually work together?
Okay, great. So the connection between the three is exactly the point of the model. So we select standards to apply to elements of reasoning. And why do we do that? We do that to develop the traits. Those are the intellectual traits like intellectual humility, intellectual integrity, intellectual autonomy, and the others. So those are the essence of why you would most likely want to go through all of this effort of using critical thinking is to demonstrate or to develop your intellectual traits.
Let's start with pillar 1, the element of thought. Paul and Elder say all human thinking contains 8 specific parts, like purpose, information, and assumptions. And if a graduate student is reading a research paper or constructing an argument, how do they start breaking it down using these elements?
Sure. So one thing you can do when reading a journal article, for example, is to specifically read the abstract, the introduction, the conclusion, and look for these specific parts. So what is the purpose of this research? Has it been stated somewhere concisely and clearly, or do we have to decide with ourselves what the purpose of the research is? What are the questions the research question itself, or what are the questions that are brought up in the journal article? From whose point of view? That's another element. So all arguments, all reasoning is done from a specific point of view. That's what the model is saying. All reasoning includes some information, some data, evidence. Okay? All reasoning is making some inference. All reasoning is based on some concepts, some conceptual understanding. And all reasoning makes assumptions. So when they say that all these elements are present when you reason, but when somebody is talking, generally they're not being conscious of every single element.
Next question. Once we disassemble a thought into its elements, we move to pillar 2, intellectual standards. So how do these standards act as a quality control filter?
Quality control filter, yes. So the standards are how we can evaluate the elements of thought, the elements of reasoning. Now, I hope we're using the concept of thinking about your thinking for the purpose of improving it. So in order to improve, we often need feedback, or we have to reflect on our own thinking and identify any weakness or opportunities. So if I am lecturing my students, I realized that something I said was not clear. So next time, if I catch it quickly, I can try to clarify it. Or maybe my line of reasoning, my logic was disrupted, or I didn't flow very well. So I can maybe improve the logic of my explanation or my argument.
Question. If a student is writing a draft of a thesis paper or preparing for a class debate right now, what are 2 or 3 essential standards they should immediately apply to self-check their work?
The standards as they are applied to an element, right? Well, number 1, I always recommend start with clear purpose.
Clarity.
Of purpose.
Purpose. Okay.
Right? Clarity of purpose. Significance of your research question. So have you chosen a challenging research question, or maybe you have opportunities to increase the significance of the question. The other one I would always recommend is obviously, and this is important in writing, from whose point of view are you considering? So when you write, you can write from the experimenter's point of view. You can also write with the society in mind. You can write from the point of view of your field or your discipline, and selecting who is in this audience, or from what point of view you're taking, you can be more strategic.
Next question. Now pillar 3. So intellectual traits. Why does repeatedly applying standards to elements eventually change us as thinkers? What does intellectual humility or intellectual courage look like in practice?
Sure. If I offer my own example as a way of explaining, growing up in America, we have a culture of having a position and arguing forcefully. So you don't back down. If you have an opinion, you stick to it. Now, the good point is, in a sense, we think it's our own opinion, and we're very outward with putting forth our own opinion. From an intellectual humility point of view, that maybe we're not practicing intellectual humility, which is a valuable trait when you're trying to practice critical thinking, because intellectual humility means always considering when you might be wrong, or you might not have all of the information, or you might concede a point. So that takes humility. Now, in certain cultures, it takes a lot of courage, intellectual courage, to challenge an authority. If you're in in a seminar, you're listening to a lecture, you might have some intellectual autonomy, thinking you have a different opinion from the lecturer. Now, that in some cultures would take a lot of intellectual courage to believe that your idea is as good as the professor's.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Next question. Bottom line, why this model so extraordinarily useful? How does adopting this framework actually save graduate students time and prevent major mistakes in their research and daily lives?
Well, unfortunately, it's not going to save you time, but it offers many opportunities to increase the value of your research, to increase the quality of your research. It opens up opportunities to explore new perspectives, ensure that you have I don't want to say required depth or accuracy, each standards, but it reminds you to consider all of the elements and raise the quality possibly by raising the quality, better explaining the nuance. When you address a complex issue, it demands nuance. If you practice and you get good at it, I can guarantee that you will hone in on the element which needs improved quicker. If you're practiced, you can very often hone in on just, okay, so if I'm listening to a student and they're explaining the research, it's not my field. They probably haven't really explained the purpose in a way that I understand it. So I can quickly ask them, can you explain again? What's the purpose of your research?
For anyone who are watching who wants to start using the Paul and Adler framework today, what is the very first step they should take when reading their next assignment?
Well, purpose comes to the forefront in most of the way that I use this model. Well, this helps because if you have an assignment, is there a deeper purpose other than submitting the assignment to the teacher to be graded? So if the only purpose is to complete the assignment so that you get so many points that work towards your completing the course and getting a good grade, then unfortunately the opportunity to learn might be in conflict, okay? So I think this is the whole part of trying to restrict students from using AI. Well, if they're using AI just to fulfill the requirements without thinking through it, if they have no purpose, if the purpose is not to learn in depth, then what's the purpose of doing the assignment?
So can we ask the professor, what is the purpose of the assignment? At least question.
It would take courage, but certainly I would hope. Sometimes it's assumed the professor is under the assumption that the purpose is clear, or they give a superficial answer such as, oh, I want you to learn the contents, for example, right? Well, then the question might be, is the homework designed well for that purpose, right? So why not ask the professor what the purpose of the assignment is?
Okay, this is a simple and powerful place to start. And Professor, thank you for walking us through the framework step by step.
Thank you.